What do we know about nature versus nurture and the Big Five personality traits? I'm Marco Perry. Welcome to the Perry Platform. So today we'll be talking about personality, and where better to begin than this very interesting theme of the Big Five personality traits to be exact. Fundamentally, they're these broad dimensions used to describe the human persona, your temperament, and your psyche. Now, these five traits are as follows. Number one is your openness to experience. That can be defined as if you're inventive/curious, and the other side of the spectrum would be consistent and cautious. Then you have conscientiousness. On one side of that spectrum, you have efficiency and being organized, and on the other side, extravagant and careless. Then the third trait is extroversion. On one side of that, you have outgoing and energetic, and on the other, solitary and reserved. Then number four, agreeableness, which is a measure on one hand of your friendliness, your compassionate behavior, versus being critical and rational. Then the fifth measure is neuroticism. On one hand, you have your sensitivity and how nervous you can get versus your resilience and your confidence. And as you would have noted, these are measures of degree. You could be highly neurotic, somewhere in the middle, a low area, the bottom 1 percentile, whatever. It's not just that you check a box or you don't. And when you cross-average your scores across these five, you get a better idea of roughly who you are as a person, which is quite interesting. Now, there are a couple things to note here. First of all, these aren't the five only characteristics that you can have in your being. They're actually smaller traits that accumulate into these broader five examples. You can think of these big five as an umbrella. Within neuroticism, as we mentioned, you have your sensitivity, your resilience, your confidence, and a bunch of other things. And we're going to get to a little bit of a questionnaire that you can do with me here to gauge your levels for each category. And further, which is going to be the point that we expand on quite a bit for this episode, we know that it's not simply a matter of you being born with these capabilities and then you're living your life sentenced to them. Nature and nurture both play a role in how these personality traits can develop in anyone. So, when it comes down to, well, what's more important then, research has shown that about half of the variation between individuals results from their genetic inheritance and half from their environment. That's so fascinating. It's to say that these things can both be equally impactful in the development of a human being. And the differences that you manifest versus another person can be attributable almost equally to the way you were born or the ways in which you were brought up. Now, the first thing I'll note here is that this is in some ways quite freeing to certain individuals. There are many people who think that, for example, their shyness is due to their innate nature, and there's nothing that they can do about it. Research shows that that's not particularly true. In fact, there are environmental things that you can add into your atmosphere to try and move things in certain directions. It's all just to say that you are not doomed or sentenced to live any particular way. Now, how things seem to be is that your genetics are going to give you a blueprint, that you have certain proclivities and certain affiliations with particular traits. It's true. You might be more neurotic than your peer. You might be more conscientious. You might be prone to extroversion or not. You might be more agreeable or not. That's fine. But the environment determines what's executed here. To give a crude example, take someone who is very open to experience, and as a society, every time they venture out from the norm, they are beaten, or they are thrown in jail, or they face a severe punishment. Well, naturally, this individual is going to adapt to their environment, and these traits are going to change. They're going to realize that, hey, it's not adaptively beneficial to me to act in these ways. Therefore, I have to start curbing these traits. So, in some sense, they still could have that genetic disposition, but the environment is adding forces that are going to curb it. And perhaps you can look at the reverse situation too, where you have someone who is the opposite of an extrovert, but there are incentives to make them more open. Now, it might not feel natural to them, but the environment can give them a push in that direction. It's also interesting to think about what happens in the case of identical twins. Now, the genes are essentially the same there. If you had a theory that genetics were the only thing that predicted how people manifest personality traits, well, following from that, you would expect identical twins to act and behave in the exact same ways. But that's not the case. The environments that they are exposed to, even within the same household, you have to think about it. It's not as if they're experiencing the exact same things at always the exact same times. In the house, maybe they're going to read a different book. Maybe they're going to hear different things from their parents. Maybe at school, they're going to meet different people. All these factors are going to change the ways in which they're manifesting their personality traits. So even with identical twins, there are going to be manifest differences that are salient there. The key message from this is that I think it's important for someone to understand their disposition so they can figure out how to erect an environment that can help them counter it, if necessary. If you understand that you're low in extroversion, you're low in openness, and you're too high in agreeableness, people are just taking advantage of you and you don't have the backbone to stand up for yourself, you're not doomed to that fate. In fact, there's something equally as powerful as the ways in which you were created that can help you change, and that is how you're interacting with the world. Sure, your body and your mind might have an attraction to a certain way of behavior, but you have the power to alter that. There are people who don't like themselves for various reasons, and you should know that there are ways in which you can improve and change. You should never feel like you have no options, because clearly you do. Just because you are drawn to something doesn't mean you can't apply some forces to counteract that. If you're seeking improvements in your life, never feel like you are pigeonholed into your current way of operation. Now, I will caveat that by saying that research has found that these traits, conscientiousness, extroversion, openness, neuroticism, they become relatively stable from middle age through old age. So, in some sense, what it's laying out here is that once you establish and solidify your pattern of behavior, it becomes the norm for you, and the ways in which you go about changing this become less attractive, and you tend to just go with the flow. So, when does that solidification occur? Well, the data shows that it seems to be around middle age, and through old age. There is that saying, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. Well, you still can, but it just becomes harder. You become stabilized. So my advice to you is, if you're noticing certain things about yourself, if you're learning about how your personality is, and there are changes you want to make, don't wait on it. The best time to act really was yesterday, but it's not too late to get started today. And just because things become stable, generally speaking, once you hit middle age, it doesn't mean that it's too late for you. With the right mindset, you can overcome that as well. It's just easier to begin this process of altering your traits when you're younger. So let's say now, well, you want to learn a little bit more about yourself. How can you go about figuring out where you stand on that spectrum of openness, neuroticism, etc.? Here are some questions that you can ask yourself to kind of see where you might be there. So beginning with openness, if you answer yes to the following questions, you can count it as a point towards your openness meter. The more yeses you have, the higher you might be here. And this is very crude, of course. It's not a definitive test, just to give you a rough idea. So, for openness, do you have a rich vocabulary? Do you have a vivid imagination? Would you describe yourself as having excellent ideas? Are you quick to understand things? Do you use difficult words? Do you spend time reflecting on ideas and such? Are you full of ideas and thinking? See how many yeses you have accumulated there. Now moving on to conscientiousness. Would you say that you are always prepared? Do you pay attention to details? Do you get chores done right away? Do you like order? Do you follow a schedule? Are you exact in your work and the things you do? Now, for extroversion, would you say you are the life of the party? Do you feel comfortable around people? Do you start conversations? Do you talk to a lot of different people at a party? Do you not mind being the center of attention? Then for agreeableness, are you interested in people? Do you sympathize with others' feelings? Do you have a soft heart? Do you take time out for others? Do you feel others' emotions? Do you make people feel at ease? And I will note here, it's interesting, some of these traits, they have real-world consequences, obviously, right? But agreeableness in particular, there has been studies that show people that are high in agreeableness have difficulties climbing things like the corporate ladder and whatnot. Perhaps because they're just not confident enough to assert themselves in the ways in which you typically do need to do to get those positions in and whatnot. Or perhaps it's because you're too passive when dealing with people. You're connecting with them too much. Now, these are not bad things per se. It just has certain advantages and disadvantages depending on the environment you find yourself in. Now, neuroticism. Would you say you get stressed out easily? Do you worry about things? Are you easily disturbed? Do you get upset easily? Do you change your mood a lot? Do you have frequent mood swings? Do you get irritated easily? Do you feel blue? Now, from that very basic exercise, you might have a rough idea of where you might stand somewhere along the spectrums of these traits. Now, to move on to the final topic of today's discussion, I want to talk about group differences. This was quite interesting to me. So, a study of gender differences in 55 nations using the Big Five inventory found that women tended to be somewhat higher than men in neuroticism, extroversion, agreeableness, and conscientiousness. The difference in neuroticism was the most prominent and consistent, with significant differences found in 49 of the 55 nations surveyed. Quite interesting. Now, we'll caveat that by saying these are not massive differences at the individual level. We're talking about the extremes of the group differences here. And these manifest in particular ways. It's not to say you take a random female and a random man, and 100% of the time, the random female is going to be higher in neuroticism. That's not true. These are aggregates we're talking about. And they manifest in particular on the tails, the extremes. You take something like aggressiveness, for example, and it's not to say that the average woman is going to be far less aggressive than the average man, but the most aggressive people in our society are typically going to be men, because that's how the distribution shapes out. And you can see that data reflected in things like the violent crime statistics. The vast majority of perpetrators there are going to be men. And even as a man, I can recognize that. There's no reason to be partisan about it. It's just a simple fact that there are differences between men and women. It's not a bad thing. It's a mixture of genetics and environment. Now, we can tinker with things on the environmental side, sure. If you alter your culture, things are going to shape up differently when it comes to manifesting personality traits, 100%. But there is a component of genetics that are far more complicated to alter. Unless we're talking about gene editing, then sure. Yeah, the future might hold that. But today, the differences rooted there are simply things that have to be accepted and understood. Now, the last piece of info that I want to put into play is this. We talked about changing the cultures in societies and those producing changes. Well, here's something that's interesting. So, gender differences in personality traits are largest in prosperous, healthy, and more gender egalitarian nations. Take that in for a second. We can actually rephrase that in a more simpler manner. In nations that are more equal, gender differences between men and women are largest. More equal in terms of opportunity, in terms of getting rid of things like gender roles. in terms of removing barriers to access, which are all good things in my opinion. You want to have an egalitarian society, but the data shows that once you get something like that, like some of the Nordic countries, men and women begin to differ more widely. Why? Well, they're free to be themselves now. When you remove things like artificial gender norms and you get rid of barriers that might force you to move in certain ways, and you have strong social safety nets, individuals can act in ways that align with their personality, that align with their nature. And therefore, we're going to see a greater difference because we know there are natural differences between men and women. And in some sense, as you get rid of barriers between the genders, you allow those natural differences to flourish. We have to change the ways in which we're viewing differences in society because, in my opinion, that really isn't a bad thing per se. If we're becoming more egalitarian, but gender differences become stronger, that's just the ways in which those people want to behave. And the discrepancies that that produces in society are not always things that have to be corrected for. And here's an example of that. We know that, generally speaking, men are more interested in things, and generally speaking, women are more interested in things like people. Now, some of this personality difference plays out in things like nursing and teaching, which align with this prototypical interest that women seem to display on average. And once again, you have to be aware of that point. We're talking about aggregate average differences. It's not to say that women can't be in something like engineering. It's just that naturally, as we're seeing the data shape up, they tend to pick careers that more closely align with that nature. In nursing and schooling, for example. And men who do have a greater interest naturally in things are shaping up situations like the mechanic industry and engineering for the most part and stuff like that. And these differences get larger in free societies with less barriers where women can be engineers if they want to, but do they actually want to? That's the question you have to ask yourself. There are people who see a discrepancy in the amount of men in nursing and the amount of women in engineering and think the society is fundamentally sexist, but that might not be the case. The data has a contrary perspective there. The less sexist your society becomes, the more these differences will manifest. That is something to carefully ponder in much of the Western world. It seems like there's been this approach where, since we're regarding ourselves as a metaphorical hammer, everything is a nail that has to be struck down. But there are multiple variables that affect everything. It's not to say that discrimination can't be playing a role to some degree, but there are biological factors at play too that have to be recognized, and these things are not necessarily bad. Now, with that, it does bring us to the end of our conversation for today. If you enjoyed the content, be sure to leave a review and share. That'll help us grow. And you can find me online at perryplatform.org and on social media at perryplatform. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you soon.